these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, folks. So, recording from Houston, we're going to talk about something we haven't really dove into much on any of these episodes, which is our space program. And of course, Houston has a long history of being a leader in the space program. Help us with that conversation. I've got Eric Berger with us. Eric, thanks so much for being on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Love to talk space, Dan.
So you're a reporter, editor. You're based here in Houston. You were at the Houston Chronicle for a while. Joined Ars Technica in 2015 as the site's senior space editor, and you were Pulitzer Prize finalist for your coverage of Hurricane Ike in 2008. So, this isn't even a subject I deal with a whole lot, just being on the committees I'm on. And I think the audience is probably curious to learn more. We have Space Force coming out. We've got SpaceX going up, Jeff Bezos, and what was his program called?
He's got New Shepard and New Glenn.
Yeah. All these billionaires going up into space, and the frontier has changed quite a bit, or the industry, let's say, has changed quite a bit, and NASA's role in it. And I think a lot of people aren't really sure what that is anymore. And really, it seems like there was a decay or a loss of interest in space for decades, really. But in the last few years, it seems like that it's no longer this sleepy space program. So what changed? What does the frontier look? What does the environment look like right now for space travel?
Yeah, so you're right. We had the Apollo program in the 1960s, 1970s. We went to the moon, and it was great, and space was a big deal. And then interest has really died off kind of continually since then. I think since about 2010, there have been two big changes. Number one, as you alluded to, SpaceX, the rise of commercial space. This is the privatization of space, private companies doing things more efficiently than NASA can. And it's really starting to pay dividends. The only way NASA can get its astronauts to the International Space Station now is on a SpaceX rocket and a SpaceX spacecraft. And they're doing that at a cost. NASA did its own internal study. If they developed that kind of capability, it would have cost 4 to 10 times more than what the government would have done.
That seems like a good deal. It's
a pretty good deal. You got to deal with people like Elon Musk to get that done, and he can be difficult to work with, but he does get the job done. And the second big trend, in addition to the privatization of space, has really been the rise of the Chinese space program. They put their first human in space in 2003, and they've had a very methodical plan. They don't change governments every 2 years. They don't have a new president every 4 to 8 years, and so they sort of make a long-range plan, and they tell their people to go do it. They provide the funding, and then they execute it. You can say what you want about authoritarian government. I think there's lots of reasons to be very critical of China, but they set out a program and they stick to it. And, in the last couple of years, they've made some really significant strides. They landed a spacecraft on the far side of the moon, something no one had ever done before. They have a couple rovers running around on the moon right now studying.
Why is it difficult? Why do we care that it went on the far side of the moon?
Well, we care because when you try to communicate with a spacecraft from Earth, you need line of sight communications. And so you have to put a special relay satellite in orbit around the moon and send that signal back. And we care because the moon is kind of the next step outward in space exploration, and not just for civil space, but for military space. It really is seen as the high ground. So China's showing a lot of interest in the moon, whereas after the Apollo program, the United States and NASA became a lot less interested, although that's changed in recent years. And the other big thing that China did just this year was they landed a rover on Mars. And not a big deal because NASA's done that 8 times, but no one else had ever done that. Russia, the Soviet Union hadn't done that. Europe had tried, had failed. And along comes China on their very first try, and they put a spacecraft on the surface of Mars, they roll the rover off, and it's still kind of running around the red planet exploring. And so they've really emerged as NASA's biggest competitor in space.
Should we feel threatened by that? How should we feel about that? And how much of a competitor are they really?
Well, they're not a competitor to NASA right now because if you add up NASA and a vibrant commercial space industry in the United States, we're way ahead of China. But I mean, NASA's kind of been spinning its wheels for a while, especially when it comes to human space exploration. You had the shuttle program, the International Space Station. We haven't been back into deep space for half a century now. So you could look at China and say, if they continue progressing at the rate they are, they'll catch up to NASA within the next decade, and then there's the potential to surpass it. So I think it's worth taking it very seriously.
Does it seem like the only reason that we're way ahead is because of our private sector?
At this point, I would say so, yes. I mean, that is the key advantage that the United States has, is you've got a couple of things. First of all, you've got private capital coming into spaceflight, and you've got lots of energy and ideas and innovation. The biggest innovation over the last 10 years in spaceflight has been the advent of reuse. You may have seen the Falcon Heavy launch when the boosters came down side by side, or you may have seen the SpaceX rocket landing on a barge. That really is a big step forward in that if we're ever going to make access to space commonplace and routine and open it up, you can't launch rockets one-off. You have to make it more like an airliner where it goes up, comes back, and you refly it again.
So you talk about the moon is this next frontier, I guess like a launching pad in some way for the next, I guess the next frontier of space exploration. And are we looking at a scenario that looks like the parody on Netflix called Space Force, where it's like us competing against the Chinese, and the Chinese have a base up there and they knock over our stuff? I mean, it's this ridiculous show. It's actually quite funny. Is that really what's on the horizon?
So I watched Space Force. I loved it. They got a lot of things wrong, like the dog in space trying to send instructions.
That was hilarious.
It was hilarious. But you could run into a situation. So like in the last year, the NASA set out this thing called the Artemis Accords, which was, they're planning to go back to the moon, and they set out some guidelines whereby, if you're going to go with us, you have to share your data. You have to not claim territory on the moon. You have to watch out for orbital debris and things like that. And one of those accords was basically like, you could not go to the moon and stake out a claim on the moon and like prevent other countries from going into that. If you remember in the Space Force, like that was like the genesis of the disagreement. Like China went to the moon and said, we claim this space and you can't come into it. So that is a potential possibility. I think it's probably a decade or two off because China's not getting people to the moon until the 2030s probably. NASA could go back more quickly, and they may or may not. But that is a kind of conflict you could get into down the road.
Do we think they should? Does NASA have any intention to? What are NASA's intentions? I mean, Elon Musk obviously wants to go to Mars. Right. Nobody seems to know what NASA wants to do. They talk about climate change a lot. Yeah.
So NASA's human spaceflight program has gone back and forth since about 2004. The George W. Bush administration wanted to go to the moon and then Mars. President Obama came in and said, we're just going to go to Mars. And the Trump administration came in and they appointed Jim Bridenstine, who turned out to be a great administrator for the space agency, really visionary. And Vice President Pence sent the goal of going back to the moon in 2024. And that's okay. That was a date that really wasn't attainable with the current funding that NASA has, but it was the right idea. And more important than that, he said, we're not going to go to the moon with flags and footprints, because that's what Apollo was. We went up there 6 times. Astronauts stayed a couple of days on the surface of the moon, and then they came back. And that was it, right? We brought a couple 1,000 pounds of rocks back. The Vice President Pence set the goal of we're going to go to the moon and we're going to stay. We're going to have a sustainable presence. And so there are reasons to do that, right? One is that they believe there's ice at the lunar poles. And if you could break down that ice into water, you have rocket propellant, because you could make liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. So there's reasons to go to the moon. And so the current plan is to go.
You could travel a lot further because you're launching from a place with much less gravity.
Exactly. So the moon has 1/6 the gravity. If you could go there and set up a fueling station on the moon or an orbit around the moon, you solved a lot of your problems. The problem is, NASA's a big bureaucracy. It's become a big bureaucracy since Apollo. And so they can get things done, but they're not done more efficiently. And so one of the things that Bridenstine, the administrator under the Trump administration, did is he tried to move the agency more toward buying services, right? Instead of NASA building the big rockets or the big spacecraft, they would go to a private company that had those rockets and buy that service. And so that seems to be a much more efficient way of doing things.
Yeah, especially if it's American-made, because as we all understand it, we've been riding with the Russians, I think, to the International Space Station.
Well, in more ways than one, yes. From the time the shuttle retired in 2011 until last year when SpaceX, went up for the first time, we'd been on Soyuz vehicles. And actually, for most of the 2010s, the main way we got our national security satellites into space, our spy satellites, military comm satellites, they were on the Atlas V rocket, which is assembled in the United States, but the engines, the RD-180s, are actually made in Russia. And so they'd been bought from Russia.
Why can't NASA just go back to the moon by 2024? Or I guess, could they? It's just that what we want to do is a little bit more involved than just an Apollo mission. Because, we went on the Apollo missions with a computer that was like, basically a T-83 calculator?
The computers in the rocket and the spacecraft were far less sophisticated than the computer and the phone in your pocket. It's hard, okay? It really is hard to get astronauts safely off the planet, onto the moon, and then back. And the biggest piece that we did not have and do not have is a lunar lander. So that's something that, it can't fail, because if the rocket goes down to the moon and then can't launch back off the surface of the moon, your astronauts are going to die, right? So you've got to make sure that system works. And the lunar module last flew in 1972, and so we don't have any lunar lander. So they're trying to get funding from Congress to build that, and they finally settled on SpaceX's Starship as the vehicle to do that. Starship, as you may know, is the vehicle they're building in Texas and flying down in South Texas. Okay. And there's been lots of legal wrangling because Jeff Bezos of Blue Origin was not happy with that decision, and so he's been holding it up in court.
Interesting. He thinks it wasn't a fair contract choice or something.
He said it wasn't fair. He said it was the Starship system was too complex. Very famously in the space community, he says it's high risk and immensely complex. But the fact is the Starship system is actually flying right now, and Blue Origin's plans are just basically blueprints.
Well, that's interesting. Bezos Musk competition. Do you see Texas? We have the Texas Medical Center here. It's this massive ecosystem of innovation and collaboration. You see something similar ever taking place in the space community?
In terms of collaboration, we'll see. It's a really interesting thing to think about. So if for a long time, the way NASA worked, the human spaceflight program is the rockets launched from Florida. They were designed at Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, and the missions were flown basically from Houston, Johnson Space Center. That's where the astronauts trained. That's where they did the planning for the missions and so forth. What we've seen over the last decade is a big change with Blue Origin to some extent, because they're launching their suborbital system out in West Texas. But the bigger change has been SpaceX, because they built the launch facility in South Texas, and no orbital rocket has ever launched from Texas before. They're talking about building this huge engine manufacturing facility in Central Texas near McGregor, where they already test engines.
Right.
And so Texas has a chance to become not one of these space states, but the leading space state if we play this right.
What does playing it right look like? What would Governor Abbott do to play that right?
He's been supportive of SpaceX.
Is that is there any policies that we should think about, or is it?
From a federal standpoint, I think the most important policy would be to continue this trend that was started really by Bridenstine to look more at NASA buying services rather than building and owning the vehicles themselves.
It would also seem to me that NASA needs a mission statement. Again, I think one of their recent, I'm looking for it, exactly what I'm talking about, but where is it? I don't know. The point is they keep talking about, they seem obsessed with climate change, which is fine. Let's be obsessed with that, and other agencies maybe. I'm not sure why NASA is, but it doesn't seem like they have a clear mission. Again, Elon Musk wants to go to Mars. Bezos just wants to make money. It seems like at the moment, what the hell does NASA want to do? And how is it going to excite the public? I think that's so important when we're talking about if we cared about getting funding for it, for instance. But I have no sense of what NASA wants.
And the idea and what so first of all, the charter that created NASA said one of its things was to study the planet Earth. So Earth science does fall under NASA, in addition to all these other mandates that it has. But you ask a very good question: is what should a NASA in the 21st century look like? Because there's lots of people who still remember Apollo and think that's what our space agency ought to be. Mm-hmm. But the times are changing, and so do you want your space agency to sort of project soft power like it did in sort of to counter China? Do you want it to augment the Space Force? Do you want it to just study planet Earth? Do you want it just to do planetary exploration? How much do you want to lean into the private sector? And quite frankly, Dan, there's no clear consensus. And every time you get a new president, sort of that vision changes a little bit.
What is the vision now? I haven't heard anything from this administration except let's destroy our interests in Afghanistan. Besides that, so what do they want to do with space? Have they made any?
Well, quite frankly, this administration has largely embraced what the Trump administration did. Within days of coming into office, Jen Psaki, the press secretary, got up and said they supported the Artemis program to go back to the moon. And they also did not seek to unwind the Space Force. Now, they have put more of an emphasis on climate change because that's a Democratic priority.
That's all they do. Yep, all they talk about.
but they have not changed sort of the tact a whole lot.
Okay, so NASA will continue in this sort of boots on the moon, as Steve Carell.
Boots on the moon.
Yeah, as people really got to watch Space Force. It is an underappreciated series. It's pretty damn good. Steve Carell is never disappoints. Anyway, so boots on the moon by 2024 is how Steve Carell says it, and that seems well and good. There's strategic value in that. There seems to be just the exploration itself, the act of actually going out and exploring and going through the motions. Seems to me to be very supportive of the other mission set that Space Force would have. Which is more on the military side. These things collaborate quite well.
You mentioned wanting to inspire people, right? And NASA is capable of doing that, much more so, I think, than most other federal agency. But they actually have to do stuff. Mm-hmm. And sending humans to the moon, I think, would be inspiring.
Especially if we're keeping humans on the moon.
Especially if we're keeping humans on the moon and normalizing it. Like now, people are just used to having people living in space because they've been up there for 20 years.
If we get TikTok videos of astronauts on the moon, funding would go through the roof.
Funding would go through the roof. So. At least you would support the vision. It's also important from a geopolitical standpoint because Russia recently just signed sort of an agreement with China to go to the moon with them, like to build an international lunar station. And the U.S. and Russia have collaborated in space for more than 20 years. After the Cold War, basically, that was one of the political things that had held us together. That relationship, the relationship between NASA and Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, is really kind of falling apart.
Why is that? What happened?
Well, a couple of things have happened, but I mean, first of all, Putin is not happy, really working with the United States, and he
seems to like us so much.
And the person he put in charge of Russia is a former journalist. I'm a journalist, so I'm not going to say anything bad about journalists, but he's not a space expert.
I'll say plenty of bad things about journalists, no offense.
He's Dmitry Rogozin, and so he has sort of sought to put turds in the punch bowl of that relationship.
Really?
And frankly, the United States really doesn't need Russia anymore.
Yeah.
And so Russia kind of wants to go its own way, and so they're sort of running toward China. So it is important for NASA to lead and go back to the moon because we really want to bring our international partners with us: Europe, Australia, Japan, Canada, UAE, partners in the Middle East. These are allies, and we would like to sort of give them a much more
a mission,
a vision, and something they'd like to be a part of, rather than sort of partnering with China.
Right, just like, hey, let's just keep doing tours on the International Space Station and watching plants grow or whatever it is we do up there.
Right. So like. The first mission to actually go to deep space, it's called the Artemis II mission. It may go in 2023, 2024. Is going to have a Canadian astronaut on it.
Oh, interesting. So deep space, where are they going?
They're going around the moon. Basically, it's a repeat of Apollo 8.
Okay. We just haven't done that in a long time.
Haven't done that in 50 years. No astronaut's gone higher than like 400 miles.
You said we haven't done any deep space exploration. So deep space just means to the moon.
Humans,
right? We sent out a bunch of sensors and things past,
Right. Whereas the Apollo program kind of wound down human exploration to low Earth orbit, that was the beginning of space solar system exploration with robots. So we've been to all the planets in the solar system, the dwarf planets like Pluto, the asteroid belt. We're going to Jupiter's moon, Europa.
A lot of science fiction movies about Europa. What are we going to find there? What do you think?
Well, I was pretty close with a former colleague of yours, John Culberson, and he was really the visionary behind that mission and got the funding. And Europa is this fascinating place because it's a moon around Jupiter. It's got an ice sheet several miles thick, But beneath that, there's more water on Europa than there is in the oceans on Earth. And there's internal heating on Europa. So like, we see life around these vents, seafloor vents in the oceans on Earth.
Yeah.
And the thinking is there could very well be life on Europa in the same manner.
An underwater sea monster. Like, I think there's a movie called Europa where they underwater sea monster.
We don't know. We got to go and find out.
So there's something going there right now.
It's going to launch in 2024.
Okay. And it's going to land in a few years.
It's not going to land. It's just going to do about 38 flybys. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Then we'll see what goes on from there. It's kind of fascinating, and I think this is what people want to see. I mean, they want to see something new, and so it's exciting that we're talking about that again, at least. What would colonizing Mars look like? I mean, how realistic is Elon Musk's dream on this?
So he started talking about settling Mars back in 2002 when he founded the company. And it seemed completely unrealistic back then. And it still seems wild today. But you've got to think about why we would send humans into space. Like, what's the purpose of human exploration in space? If you could send a robot to Mars for 1/100th the cost, why would you send a human to Mars, right? For scientific reasons, this is really not useful. You might send them to the moon because it's inspirational, but even then the cost is prohibitively high. So there's really only one reason why I think you would want to send humans to Mars or beyond. And that's with the eventual intent of settling our solar system and then looking to worlds beyond ours. And that may sound like sci-fi, and it is science fiction, but he is taking the first steps toward making that a reality. The Starship vehicle that they're building in South Texas, what they've been blowing up, and they've been trying to get it right, because what they're blowing them up because it's really hard. They want to build a fully reusable first and second stage rocket that you could literally put dozens of people and send to the moon and to Mars. And just to give you an example of like how big of a difference this is.
Does it look like a rocket or does it look like a plane?
It's a big, tall, shiny metal rocket. Okay. And the upper stage has little flaps on it, you could say are wings, but it really looks like a 21st century spacecraft out of a science fiction novel.
It looks similar to, I think, if there's a series called Mars, which is actually really good, and it's a mix between a documentary, like a real documentary from modern times, and then this sort of science fiction from the future, and they get to Mars in this, like an Elon Musk looking rocket that apparently sounds just like that. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to visualize it for people. Yeah. Like, what should we be imagining here?
I mean, this is a radically different capability. If you had taken the lunar module back in the 1960s and said, we just want to send cargo to the moon and that, how much could you take? And the answer was about 5 tons, okay? Which is a lot, but...
Seems like a lot, yeah.
You could take Starship and send it to the moon. And if it works, which it probably will, it'll take 200 tons.
That's a lot of stuff.
That's a lot of stuff.
That's a whole colony.
Well, not really. Like if you want
it's a little colony.
If you want to have a self-sustaining settlement on Mars, you need about 1 million tons on Mars.
Oh, on Mars, but what about the moon?
Well, the moon. I mean, less because it's close by and you can resupply it. The idea would be Mars. You'd probably like to be able to be self-sustaining there.
And okay, so what does that look like? What is a self-sustaining colony? I mean, you got to have plants making oxygen. Like, what are we doing? What are the basic requirements to make this happen? And where's our technology at?
Right. So Mars is far from a garden spot. It's far less hospitable than the surface of Mount Everest or the surface of the tallest mountain in Antarctica.
Yeah.
So you're probably living in domes.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I mean, one of the questions I have about ever colonizing Mars is, what would that look like? We just forever live in domes? Because it doesn't seem to me it doesn't seem all that realistic to geoengineer Mars into something different.
Yeah, the geoengineering studies of making Mars habitable, there's no good answers. Like, Elon likes to wear a T-shirt called "Nuke Mars," where you would nuke the poles and make the atmosphere thicker. He gets a lot of crap for that, understandably. But you talk to physicists and they say, I don't think it's going to work.
What's the harm in trying? Just go nuke it. There's nobody there.
So
we nuke our own deserts all the time. Why can't you nuke Mars?
The problem is, like, there's nowhere else in the solar system that compares to Earth, right? It's the only good planet to live on. And there's no moons really that are good to live on either. But if you believe, Dan, that humans are destined if you believe in manifest destiny and humans are destined to sort of explore, settle beyond, at some point we're going to probably want to move beyond Earth. And Mars is far from ideal, but it's the best place to start. Yeah. And then from there, you learn techniques, and then you can maybe think about going to planets around other stars.
Well, I think there's an inherent good in simply exploring. And I think a lot of people can get behind that. I mean, you're always going to have your naysayers.
Sure.
The people were really mad that Jeff Bezos and Elon, all these guys, and
Richard Branson
were going up, and they're like, why can these billionaires do this, but we have all these problems here? Well, you're always going to have problems here. So if that's your argument, you'll never do anything except expand our welfare state. Like that, and that's basically the argument. I don't think it's a very good one. But, it's not either or.
I don't either. And that's right. I mean, these guys are not spending their money. They're not launching rockets full of money to the moon, right? They're spending all that money on Earth. So they're employing people here.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that does get lost in it. And, they do pay taxes, as it turns out. But the resentment politics aside, the Bernie Sanders politics aside, it is happening. And I think there's a good. Is it practical? Will it have any practical benefit for a single person on Earth for us to go to Mars in this century? Maybe not, but there is something about it that I think is inspirational and good, and that a lot of people would agree that we can get behind.
I think you either sort of fundamentally believe that humans are destined to settle beyond planet Earth or not. I mean, this planet has a finite amount of resources. We're dealing with, some environmental problems. So if you could get all of your energy from the sun by putting, solar panels at geostationary space and sending that power to Earth, and instead of strip mining Africa for cobalt or rare earth metals, if you could get that from asteroids and bring that back to Earth, wouldn't that be better? And so that's one of the promises of commercial space is that, look, we have all these resources we need here on Earth. Could we get them elsewhere and bring them back to Earth? Because this is the best planet to live on, and there's nowhere close.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. I mean, maybe it's hundreds of years away, but you got to start.
That's exactly right. You got to start somewhere.
Let's talk some specifics here. It looks like NASA's working on this within. Oh, sorry. Hold on. Let's go back. Oh, well, related to. So going back to what it takes to live on Mars, this Commercial Lunar Payload Services Initiative, CLPS program. So this is for the moon. This would be ostensibly if you want to live on Mars as well. Can you just give us an idea of what that even means? Like, again, and is the technology there for living there? It's just hard to get it all there.
The technology is there for living on the moon. It's hard to get it there, and we got to solve some problems, but they are solvable problems. CLPS is a great program. We talked earlier about buying services, and this was NASA saying, okay, we have a scientific, we want to build a rover and send it to the south pole of the moon and let it go in these craters and see if there's actually ice there or water or what those resources, because we've never explored those. And they say we could build our own lander and launch it, but it would probably cost us X $1 billion to do that. Instead, what they've done is they've gone to the private sector and said, okay, look, Maston, or look, there's a company called Intuitive Machines in Houston, and they're building lunar landers, and they're selling that service to NASA. Yeah. And so they're taking private money, and then they're going out and trying to win government contracts. So CLPS basically is NASA putting its hand up in the air and saying, we want to buy a ride for this payload in 2023. We want to buy this in 2024, and we'll pay you. We're doing
what the defense industry does.
Exactly what the defense industry does.
That's what space has become. It's become the military-industrial complex that everybody.
That's what NASA's trying to get to, because it seems like it's a better model.
Right. It's just more efficient. Well, that's fascinating. So, but can you talk any more specifics? I mean, what would it look like to live on the moon right now? What would these what would these domes look like? How do they get food? What does a self-sustaining colony look like?
So NASA hasn't really released those plans, but there's several routes you could go. One thing you could do is take a pressurized module like we have on the International Space Station and just plunk those down on the lunar surface. Okay. There's a company in Italy called Thales that builds those, and they could build those for the moon. You could also, we could investigate the lava tubes on the moon, which are basically underground large caves, and you could make those habitable. but we're going to have to do some exploring to check those out and see what they're really like. And so, we're not going to build a big lunar settlement right away, but you could, you got to go there and look at and do some exploring first before you finally decide on your architecture.
Yeah. So some of the big news over the weekend was Pentagon is poised to unveil a space weapon, declassifying it for the first time. And space weapons are an important development against anything our adversaries might do. That's one reason it's important. Second, they've been really classified. Space weapons, they sound cool. Can you tell us what that even means? Like, what are they even talking about? And why is it significant for the Pentagon to declassify? Is that a message being sent?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
So, Space Force is not Marines on the moon like in the TV show yet.
Hey, maybe one day.
Maybe one day.
And by the way, we need to make, this was my amendment that actually passed the House in the last NDAA, but then the Senate got all grumpy about it, to make Space Force use Navy ranks instead of current Air Force ranks, because you should not have a colonel of a starship. It needs to be a captain.
Well, I have to agree with that one.
Yeah, 100%. All Americans would agree on that, because people are like, "What do you mean Navy ranks?" And I'm like Star Trek, like Star Wars, Spaceballs, everything in pop culture is Navy ranks, and that's how it should be in Space Force. But the Air Force got all upset about it. But one day I will win this battle, and they will transition to Navy ranks. It's
canon, so yeah, it's for sure. So what Space Force is right now? One of the main things that they're trying to do is protect U.S. assets in space, and so we have as you well know better than I do. We have these very powerful satellites, Earth observing satellites, military communication satellites that basically allow our military to communicate, to keep tabs on what our adversaries around the world are doing, and strike back. And you're getting command and control functions on some of these sophisticated satellites in space. And so the number one priority of the Space Force is to protect those assets. And over the last, or in 2007, China demonstrated the capability to use an anti-satellite weapon, basically fired a kinetic projectile from the surface of the Earth and shot down one of its own satellites. India did the same thing in 2019. And so these were these countries coming out and saying, look, we are emerging space powers, and we have the capability to hit satellites.
Can we do that? No problem?
Yes, we can do that. And so the United States has recognized that vulnerability, and so they've been developing countermeasures, right? And those countermeasures could be like chaff on a satellite that scrambled an interceptor. It could be like something on the ground to shoot those down. It's not clear, but what the news that came out recently in a Breaking Defense article was that for some time now, General Hyten and the chiefs of staff have been considering, a demonstration of basically a space weapon. And it's believed that this space weapon would be basically some way to protect our own satellites, whether that's like a laser on our own satellites that's already there. And the idea would be that we would send a message to our adversaries that, look, okay, it's great that you've developed these anti-space weapons and you're proud of them, but we can protect ourselves. So you really don't want to get in a shooting war.
You're wasting your money.
You don't want to get in a shooting war with us.
That's interesting. And the strategic value in declassifying that and doing such a demonstration, I think, especially now, because things aren't great for the United States when it comes to just our standing and people's certainty that we will defend our interests.
Yeah,
it's a problem at the moment. What else do I want to cover here? We've covered that. We've covered the natural resources. One thing I have a question on. This gets into what I do deal with on my committee, which is 5G coverage, and should we build fiber optic cable everywhere in the United States, even if it's like miles and miles of fiber optic cable for 5 people to have internet out in the rural areas, or is there a better way to do it with low Earth satellites? And curious what your thoughts are on that. Talking about Elon Musk's Starlink program, which would do that. It's his provide internet to everybody solution, but it requires thousands of these little satellites. And is something like that realistic? How can we even track all the satellites out there now? Is it getting to be too crowded? I know I think you probably go online and find a tracker of all of the things in space, and it's kind of overwhelming. Granted, you zoom in and maybe it's less overwhelming. There's still a lot of space out there, but what's the truth there?
So it's a complicated issue, and we're about to find out because SpaceX is launching those satellites. They've launched more than 600 this year alone.
So do they have to check with anybody?
Yeah, they have to get FAA approval for the launches, and they have to get the FCC approval, basically to expand their constellation.
Okay.
But
what's DFCC?
FCC, Federal
FCC.
Federal Communications Commission. But they've been fairly permissive. Like, unless you're like really going to do obvious harm, they're going to permit you to go. And it's not just SpaceX. You know, Amazon with Project Kuiper is looking to do this. Telesat in Canada is doing it. OneWeb, a UK company, has launched several hundred satellites. They're not going after the consumer market, but they're going after enterprise and governments. And China's going to do their own LEO, low Earth orbit satellite internet network. And so these constellations are coming. And it's going to be a major problem because we've already seen an uptick in potential collisions with all of these Starlink satellites going up. You know, for comparison, SpaceX now operates more satellites in space than any country or any company in the world. And they just started launching these a couple of years ago.
So how big are these low Earth?
They're about 350 pounds, about the size of a mini refrigerator. And they can send up about 60 of them at a time on a Falcon 9 rocket. And that service is a real thing. It's already happening. Now there are some, they don't have their full constellation, so there's some dropouts. But like there's, tribes in Alaska, Inuits, who are getting internet like that they didn't have before, and it was very useful during the pandemic because they were going to online school. But if you don't have internet, how do you do online school?
How do they like sign up for that internet? How do they do that?
You can order Starlink terminals. Like you can go online to SpaceX and order a terminal. It's like a couple $100, and then you pay a monthly fee. And if they serve your area, you can sign up. And as I say, as they're building out their constellation, they'll serve basically all of the world in a few years.
Huh.
So that is a good thing because you don't have to put 5G or cable or whatever, or towers everywhere. Someone can just have a little terminal and get this service. But it does create very real issues with debris, and I don't have a concrete answer for you. Other than, from a policy standpoint, one thing we really need to be focused on is making sure that the Department of Defense has the tools it needs to track all of these satellites and to track potential debris and make sure we're, making, avoiding these collisions. And some of that policy was hammered out under the National Space Council that was instituted during the Trump administration. And that's continuing under the Biden administration, although they haven't met yet. But that's something I'd be very concerned about because commercial space is very important to the future of the United States. But if we render low Earth orbit a cloud of debris, you've just completely shut down.
What is low Earth orbit? What height?
So low Earth orbit is from about 60 miles up, which is where the atmosphere basically stops, to about, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 miles up. So it's after that you get to middle Earth orbit and then out to geostationary.
Okay. Are these low Earth satellites geostationary as well?
Geostationary is much higher. It's about 30,000 miles, and that's where basically they're falling around the Earth as rapidly as the Earth is rotating, so they're always looking down at the same spot.
Right. So this network that Elon Musk puts out there, it's intermittent because it's not geostationary.
Right, and that was like the key technology breakthrough is if the satellites are zipping overhead, like you've got to make sure that one is passing off to the next, and so you need you need interconnected laser links, and you need lots of satellites, and so they're solving those problems. Like it's getting much better.
So where do they have coverage?
Right now,
do they cover like a latitude then?
Yeah.
Is that the goal? Like they cover a specific latitude, a string of constant coverage there?
Yeah, right now, like above 50 degrees latitude is pretty good coverage. And they're sort of bringing that down as
Where's 50 degrees?
It's like Canada, northern United States.
Why is he giving this to Canada? What's going on?
It's complicated orbital dynamic stuff that I don't fully understand.
Well, I guess you need less satellites the higher latitude you are.
I think that's maybe part of it, and they have put up about, I think, 1,600 satellites so far, and they've got a ways to go. They want to put up eventually 10,000 or more.
It's fascinating. So Texas is, I guess, last on his list. Fine. All right, let's talk about, let's wrap this up with what the hell's going on with UFOs or UAPs, whatever we want to call them.
Yeah.
What do you think of the Pentagon report, the IC report, which basically said, we don't know anything?
I think they don't know anything. I think there are lots of interesting sightings all the time, and pretty much all of them can probably be explained by, things we don't know about birds or classified technology. I do think it's useful that we are looking into this, and I do think it's useful that the government is acknowledging that it is. And so I think transparency is the answer here. The problem is you've got a certain group of people who think it's UFOs regardless. And I guess that's okay. But there's just, if you're going to make a grand claim that there's another species out there in space that's spying on us, you better have pretty good evidence.
Yeah. Well, okay. So do you think it's a higher chance? Because, I mean, some of these videos, some of this evidence, there's no way that there's some natural explanation for that. The Tic Tac moving around off the coast of San Diego. Same with some of these sightings off the coast of Virginia by Navy pilots. So, is it you think it's more likely that it's just a classified piece of equipment? But then, are we're just not going to tell anybody about it? I mean, we can't seem to get any reports on that either.
I mean. If you can't get that answer, Dan, I can't get that answer.
I can't. It's very frustrating. That's why Congress made them give it to us, and we still don't have it.
Yeah, the report was very disappointing.
Yeah, and it was just like we don't know anything, and I don't think they can do that if it's not true. I don't, and I mean, you would think the president would know, and Trump definitely would have tweeted about it by now if he had something.
If he had found evidence of aliens, I think he would have been felt compelled to share that.
Yeah. I mean, it begs the question, like, what are the possibilities there? What do you think of Joe Rogan's interview with Bob Lazar? What does that strike you as?
I mean, I like to come from a point of like. Carl Sagan said, if you're going to have great claims, require great evidence. And these are pretty great claims, and so you better have pretty great evidence to back them up. We have now explored the moon pretty well. We've explored, Mars, the surface of Mars. We've sent satellites around that to look at it, and so we've seen no real evidence of other people's or other civilizations out there. I think it's. The galaxy is a big place, and one of the great things we've found out over the last decade, thanks to a NASA's technology program, is that there's all kinds of planets, Earth-sized worlds out there. So, like literally billions and billions of Earth-sized worlds around stars that could harbor life in our galaxy. So, I think there's probably life out there. I've yet, and we've been listening for it with SETI and other projects like that, and we haven't heard any definitive evidence. I would need to see some pretty compelling evidence to believe that these other life forms are here, but I certainly think it's possible.
Yeah, and what's their intentions? Because it's as if they make it very obvious that they're there, but they still don't like give us a real hard evidence. Like, hey, no, really, we're here. Hello. They still don't do that. As Elon Musk said famously in the Joe Rogan interview, well, they're very, he's just like, I don't believe them. I don't really think about them. They're very subtle if they're out there. And Joe's like, you've wanted to go to Mars for 20 years. You don't think about aliens? And I'm thinking that's exactly what a real alien would say. I mean, you'll ask Joe Rogan about it. He'll say, oh, no, Elon Musk is absolutely an alien. And I think he's only a quarter joking there.
So I've written a book about SpaceX, and I spent a lot of time around Elon for that book. And he is a unique human being. Like, he's super smart, right? I mean, I've interviewed Stephen Hawking 4 times. Like, I've been around smart people, but Elon is like, pretty up there. And he marries that with like this insane work ethic, and he's like always working. And he's not doing it to buy a $500 million mega yacht like Jeff Bezos. He's doing it because like he does want to go to Mars. Like, that is his vision. So he's not he's an alien, but he's definitely an different from most human beings.
Yeah, well, that's clear. Yeah, well, we'll just keep waiting on those answers, I guess. Maybe we just look. NASA may take that under their purview, like looking. For somebody's got to. I mean, I think Space Force is taking that under its purview, but really from a investigation defense, I don't think they're doing a whole lot.
Yeah,
I'm not sure what there is to do necessarily. It's unclear to me.
Well, we're looking, right? We've got radio telescopes that are listening for signs, and but you really can. We can't really go out to them yet, so they would have to come here. And you asked about their intentions, and I think their intentions would be bad. I mean, if you invested all of the time and effort to come to a world around another planet, chances are you want some
just buzz around our military installations in New Mexico and off the coast.
Chances are you want some resource here, and it's probably not a resource we want to give up. So
yeah. Well, that's a scary thought. And what's interesting too is let's say these things buzzing off the coast of San Diego are alien spacecraft. They know that we see them. I mean, they're so much more advanced than we are, just based on how these aircraft are moving. They must know, and they don't seem to care. It's just odd. It is this sort of just strange situation that's inexplicable.
Yeah.
And maybe it is just human technology that is extremely advanced that nobody wants to talk about. But if even Congress can't get that information, then I'm not really, I don't know. Maybe we just have to believe that they actually don't know what it is, which is kind of frightening as well.
I think that's possible, that they don't know what it is.
Well, we remain unsatisfied on that question.
Absolutely.
Eric, thanks so much for being on. This is really enlightening for a lot of people who probably haven't been looking into this issue at all. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure, Dan. Thanks so much.